The racist judge smirked as he sentenced an innocent black teenager to death. The truth didn't matter. The evidence didn't matter. The boy's mother collapsed in agony, the courtroom stunned into silence. But just as the judge prepared to walk away, thinking he had won, one person stood up, pointed directly at him, and what they revealed next turned the entire trial into chaos. C. The fluorescent lights of courtroom 3B buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting a sickly pallor over 17-year-old Marcus Johnson's face. His school's Honor Society pin, which his mother had insisted he wear for luck, caught the harsh light as his shoulders tensed beneath his too large borrowed suit. The air conditioning hummed aggressively, yet couldn't mask the sound of Judge William Hargrove's voice as it delivered the words that would end a young man's life. Hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection. Judge Hargrove's lips curled almost imperceptibly as he pronounced the sentence. To most, it might have appeared as nothing more than the solemn expression appropriate for such a grave pronouncement. But to Marcus, who had spent the past 2 weeks watching the judge's every micro-expression, it was unmistakable: satisfaction. The year was 1986, but inside Montgomery County Courthouse, it might as well have been 1950. The wood-paneled walls had absorbed decades of injustice. The American flag behind the judge's bench, a silent witness to the uneven scales of justice. "No, my baby, he didn't do it. My boy didn't kill nobody." Yvette Johnson's scream pierced the courtroom's suffocating tension as she collapsed to her knees in the first row, her hospital orderly uniform still wrinkled from the night shift she'd worked before rushing to court. For 15 years since her husband's body had returned from Vietnam in a flag-draped coffin, she'd worked double shifts, sacrificed everything to give Marcus opportunities she never had, all for it to end here. Marcus's mind flashed back through the mockery of a trial, a parade of white witnesses whose testimonies contradicted each other, forensic evidence handled with blatant negligence, the 3 friends who swore he was at a basketball game during the murder, dismissed as unreliable. His court-appointed attorney, overworked and underprepared, had barely managed 4 hours of preparation for a capital case. "Your Honor," that same attorney half-heartedly began, "we intend to appeal—" "Appeal noted," Judge Hargrove cut him off, already gathering his papers. "Court is adjourned." The bailiff approached Marcus, handcuffs ready. On the wall behind them, a digital display scrolled through announcements, momentarily showing statistics from a recent state judicial review. Black defendants with white victims received death sentences at 23 times the rate of white defendants with black victims in the county. Judge Hargrove rose, robes swishing as he moved toward his chamber's door, no doubt anticipating the congratulatory calls from influential friends that would follow. Another dangerous element removed from society. Another message sent to the black community about their place in Montgomery County. "Wait." The voice came from an unexpected direction. District Attorney James Reynolds stood, his tall frame rising from the prosecution table, where moments ago he had secured what should have been another victory in his 30-year career. His face had drained of color, and his hand shook slightly as he raised it, pointing directly at Judge Hargrove. "Your Honor, I can no longer remain silent." The courtroom froze. The bailiff's hands stilled on Marcus's wrists. Reynolds reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "Last night, while preparing final remarks, I discovered these documents in your chambers. Documents that prove a decades-long pattern of judicial misconduct, specifically targeting young black men." He held up a second folder. "And these, evidence of your affiliation with groups that explicitly advocate for racial superiority and the systematic oppression of black Americans." Judge Hargrove's face contorted with shock, then rage. "How dare you! Bailiff, remove Mr. Reynolds immediately." But Reynolds stood his ground as the room erupted into chaos, his voice cutting through. "I refused to see it before, but I cannot be complicit any longer. This court has not served justice today. It has perpetuated a monstrous injustice. Marcus, still processing the death sentence that had been pronounced moments ago, looked up with the first flicker of hope he'd felt in months. His mother's sobs quieted as she raised her head to witness the extraordinary scene unfolding. "I've had doubts about this case from the very beginning," Reynolds continued, his voice steadying as the initial shock of his own actions gave way to resolve. The manila folder trembled slightly in his hand. The timeline never made sense. The witness testimonies were contradictory. The physical evidence was circumstantial at best. Judge Hargrove's face flushed crimson. "Mr. Reynolds, you are out of order. This is highly inappropriate and unprofessional. What's inappropriate is sending an innocent boy to die to maintain your perfect conviction record against young black men." Reynolds turned to address the stunned courtroom. "I was pressured to pursue this case aggressively. To make an example, the victim was the daughter of Gregory Whitman, owner of half the businesses in this county." The implications of Reynolds' actions crashed down around him even as he spoke. 30 years as a prosecutor, hundreds of cases. If Hargrove's bias was proven, how many convictions would be called into question? How many lives had been destroyed by this systematic corruption? "This man is clearly having some kind of breakdown," Hargrove declared, his voice regaining its authoritative edge. "Bailiff, remove him from my courtroom and call for a psychiatric evaluation." The bailiff took a hesitant step forward, then stopped, eyes darting between the judge and the district attorney. Other court officials exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody moved with conviction to follow the judge's order, a telling hesitation that revealed the first crack in Hargrove's facade of absolute authority. Marcus watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded. His mind flashed to the moment 3 months ago when he'd received his acceptance letter to Georgia Tech's engineering program. His mother had cried happy tears that day, pinning the letter to their refrigerator next to his perfect attendance certificates and academic awards. He remembered the neighborhood kids he tutored in mathematics every Wednesday at the community center, their faces lighting up when they finally understood a difficult concept. The contrast was brutal, a system that had seen none of that. To Judge Hargrove and the machinery of justice in Montgomery County, Marcus was just another black body to be processed, another statistic, another example to maintain order. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Sheriff Davis strode in, his weathered face set in grim lines, hand resting on his holstered gun. He nodded deferentially toward Judge Hargrove, his fishing buddy of 20 years, before turning a hard stare toward Reynolds. "James," the sheriff said, using the district attorney's first name, "I think you need to step outside and cool down." It wasn't a suggestion. Reynolds stood his ground. "I've already sent copies of everything to the State Bar Association and the Department of Justice. This doesn't end today, even if you arrest me." As if on cue, court officers moved to flank Reynolds. Outside in the corridor, phones were ringing. The county's power brokers were already mobilizing. Judges, politicians, business leaders, all with vested interests in maintaining the status quo that kept their power intact. In the gallery, Yvette Johnson had regained her composure, fury replacing despair. She slipped out a side door where Pastor Williams from First Baptist waited. He handed her his cell phone. "The NAACP legal team is on the line," he whispered. "They've been documenting judicial disparities in this county for years. They just needed concrete evidence." In the third row, Alyssa Chen closed her notebook. The young journalist had come to cover what she thought would be a routine sentencing. Instead, she'd witnessed the first tremor of what could become an earthquake. She slipped out, already planning calls to courthouse clerks who might provide access to Hargrove's past cases. Meanwhile, deputies escorted Marcus back to his holding cell. The small concrete room closed around him like a tomb. The reality of his death sentence, however temporarily disrupted by Reynolds' outburst, settled onto his shoulders. He cycled through rage, terror and numbing despair in waves that threatened to drown him. "Breathe, young blood. Just breathe." The voice came from the adjacent cell. Walter Griggs, 63 years old, had spent 20 years incarcerated for a crime DNA evidence had recently proven he couldn't have committed. His case was under review, a process that had already taken 18 months. "They can take your freedom, but don't let them take your dignity," Walter counseled quietly. "Don't let them break who you are inside." 3 floors above, Reynolds found himself locked out of his office computer. His assistant avoided eye contact as he gathered personal items from his desk. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "2 men in suits asking questions about our finances and your mental health history." They were moving quickly to discredit him. Reynolds ducked into an empty conference room and pulled out a personal cell phone. He scrolled to a contact labeled Mike Sullivan-DOJ and pressed call. "It's worse than we thought," he said, when his old law school friend answered. "And the state system won't help. They're all Hargrove's people." "I'm listening," came the reply from the federal prosecutor's office in Atlanta. "Start from the beginning." 3 days later, the Montgomery County Courthouse stood transformed. Hundreds of protesters lined the perimeter, their signs demanding "Justice for Marcus" and "End judicial racism" visible from blocks away. National news vans crowded the parking lot, satellite dishes extended toward the sky. Inside courtroom 1A, the largest in the building, every seat was filled for the emergency hearing. Judge Eleanor Williams, a stern, silver-haired jurist from the state capitol, had been appointed to preside after Alyssa Chen's bombshell exposé hit the front page of not just the local paper, but several major national outlets. Justice for sale, inside Judge Hargrove's racist death sentences, had sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. Chen had worked around the clock, following Reynolds' evidence trail and interviewing court clerks and former defendants. What she uncovered was a pattern so blatant it couldn't be ignored, even by those who had enabled it for decades. Marcus sat at the defense table in a fresh orange jumpsuit, his mother directly behind him in the gallery. Across the aisle sat the Whitmans, parents of Sarah, the murdered girl, looking shell-shocked as their carefully constructed narrative of justice unraveled before them. Judge Williams gavelled the hearing to order. "These are extraordinary circumstances that demand extraordinary scrutiny," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of 40 years on the bench. "Mr. Reynolds, please present your evidence." Reynolds approached with 3 thick binders, which he placed on the evidence table. His suit was rumpled from 3 sleepless nights, but his voice was clear. "Your Honor, the first binder contains journal entries from Judge Hargrove's private diaries, dating back 25 years. In them, he explicitly details his contempt for black defendants who come before his bench. He read selected passages that made even the most stoic observers flinch. Another one from the projects today, They Never Learn, gave Johnson's boy the maximum, need to send a message to that neighborhood. These people only understand one language, severe punishment. Reynolds continued, "The second binder contains statistical analyses of Judge Hargrove's sentencing patterns compared to state and national averages. The racial disparities cannot be explained by any factor other than bias." Charts displayed on the courtroom's monitors showed the stark reality in cold numbers. Black defendants consistently received sentences 35% longer than white defendants for identical crimes, rising to 70% longer when the victim was white. "The third binder contains recordings," Reynolds said, his voice quieter now. "Conversations between Judge Hargrove and various parties, including myself, revealing explicit instructions to pursue cases against black defendants with maximum aggression regardless of evidence quality." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom as a recording played. Hargrove's unmistakable voice. "We need to keep those people in line, James. Community safety isn't built on coddling criminals. You know what neighborhoods produce these problems. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. The bailiff approached Judge Williams, delivering a note. After reading it, she announced, "The court calls Leslie Travers." A visibly nervous young white woman entered, Sarah Whitman's best friend. She clutched a USB drive in her trembling hand. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," she said, her voice barely audible at first. Sarah wouldn't want an innocent person to die for what happened to her. The USB contained security camera footage from a convenience store 2 blocks from the murder scene. It clearly showed Sarah's ex-boyfriend, Bradley Thompson, son of Judge Hargrove's golf partner, and the county's largest real estate developer, entering the store at 10:42 p.m., directly contradicting his alibi that he was out of town that night. The timestamp was just 15 minutes after the estimated time of Sarah's murder, and the location just 3 blocks from where her body was found. "I gave this to Judge Hargrove during the trial," Leslie testified, tears streaming down her face. "He said he'd make sure the right people saw it. But then it was never mentioned again." The Whitman family visibly recoiled, Mr. Whitman placing a steadying hand on his wife's shoulder as the implications became clear. Their daughter's real killer had walked free, while an innocent young man nearly paid with his life. When Judge Williams invited Marcus to speak, the courtroom fell silent. He rose slowly, the chains on his wrists clinking softly. "I've spent every night since my arrest trying to understand why this happened to me," he began, his voice steady despite everything. "I wondered what I did wrong, why nobody believed me, why my life didn't seem to matter." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I realize now that this isn't just about me. It's about every person who looks like me who sat in this courtroom and others like it. It's about a system that was designed to see us as guilty from the moment we enter. Some of us have someone like Mr. Reynolds to speak up. Most don't." In the gallery, several jurors from Marcus's trial hung their heads, confronted with the machinery of injustice they had unwittingly served. Mrs. Whitman suddenly stood and walked across the center aisle, an invisible boundary rarely crossed in the racially segregated seating that had naturally formed. She stopped beside Yvette Johnson. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I wanted justice for my daughter so badly that I couldn't see what was happening." The two mothers, both victims of different kinds of injustice, regarded each other in a moment of raw human recognition. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Hargrove, now seated at the defendant's table, rose to his feet. "This is nothing but a witch hunt," he declared, his composure cracking. "I have served this community for 30 years, maintaining order and protecting decent citizens from criminal elements." Judge Williams fixed him with a steely gaze. "Care to explain these diaries and recordings, Judge Hargrove?" "My methods may seem harsh to outsiders, but the reality is these communities need firm handling," Hargrove continued, his voice rising. "The statistics reflect natural tendencies in these populations toward criminal behavior, not bias in my courtroom." The mask had slipped completely. In his desperation, Hargrove had revealed exactly what Reynolds claimed, the deeply entrenched racism that had guided his judicial decisions for decades. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Williams banged her gavel repeatedly, but the damage was done. Hargrove's own words had sealed his fate more definitively than any evidence could have. 1 week later, in a subdued proceeding that lasted less than 15 minutes, Marcus Johnson's conviction was officially vacated. Judge Williams's voice echoed in the half-empty courtroom as she declared, "In light of the evidence presented, this court finds that a grave miscarriage of justice has occurred, but freedom came with asterisks." While the court acknowledges this specific injustice, Judge Williams continued, choosing her words carefully, "we must emphasize that this represents an isolated failure of process rather than evidence of systemic bias. The institutional self-preservation was immediate and predictable. The county commissioners issued statements about their unwavering commitment to equal justice, while simultaneously fighting against a broader review of cases. Local papers ran editorials characterizing Hargrove as one bad apple, rather than the product of a poisoned system. For Marcus, exoneration on paper didn't translate to exoneration in life. His scholarship to Georgia Tech had been given to another student. Nightmares plagued his sleep, visions of lethal injection tables and prison cells that left him gasping in the darkness of his childhood bedroom. He flinched at the sound of keys jingling, at doors closing too loudly. Even in his own neighborhood, whispers followed him. Some neighbors crossed the street when they saw him coming, the shadow of accusation still clinging to him despite his proven innocence. There must have been something, their averted gazes seemed to say. Yvette's health, already compromised by years of exhausting work, had deteriorated badly during Marcus's ordeal. The cancer she'd battled into remission 3 years earlier had returned, her immune system weakened by months of stress and anguish. Medical bills mounted as quickly as legal ones had during the trial. James Reynolds found himself a pariah in legal circles. Former colleagues declined his calls. Judges who had once welcomed him warmly now regarded him with cold formality or outright hostility. He had broken their cardinal rule, exposing the machinery that kept the system running smoothly. After 30 days of administrative leave, Reynolds resigned from the district attorney's office. Using his retirement savings, he rented a small office above a barbershop in the predominantly black east side of town and hung a simple sign, Reynolds Legal Services, Case Reviews. Judge William Hargrove, meanwhile, faced remarkably few consequences for decades of documented bias. After a closed-door meeting with the Judicial Review Board, he announced his early retirement, his pension and benefits package intact. He sold his home in Montgomery County and moved to Florida, where neighbors would know nothing of his past. The only real accountability came from the federal level. 6 weeks after Marcus's release, Department of Justice investigators arrived to begin examining hundreds of Judge Hargrove's previous cases. Their preliminary findings identified at least 37 convictions, showing similar patterns of evidentiary suppression and racial bias. "We're just scratching the surface," the lead investigator told Alyssa Chen in a follow-up article that received far less attention than her original exposé. Public interest had already waned, the news cycle moving on to fresher outrages. For the Johnson family, rebuilding came slowly. The community that had once kept a respectful distance now rallied around them. Pastor Williams organized a medical fundraiser for Yvette. Marcus's former teachers helped him apply for community college scholarships to begin rebuilding his academic record. 3 months after his release, Marcus sat in the Johnson living room, surrounded by paperwork, hospital bills for his mother, college applications, forms for the compensation claim that might take years to process. "You should rest," Yvette called from her bedroom, where she recovered from another round of chemotherapy. "Almost done, Mama," he answered, though the stack seemed endless. His phone buzzed with a text from Walter Griggs, the older inmate whose wisdom had helped him survive those darkest days. After 40 legal motions and 22 years of wrongful imprisonment, Walter had finally been released 2 weeks earlier. "Still coming tomorrow?" the text read. "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied. The next morning, Marcus drove Walter to Montgomery State Penitentiary. The 2 men passed through security, visitor badges clipped to their shirts. In a room lined with plastic chairs, 12 incarcerated men waited. "This is Marcus Johnson," Walter introduced him to the prison advocacy group. "He's going to help us review your cases." One by one, Marcus listened to their stories, so similar to his own, yet without the extraordinary intervention that had saved him from execution. Men who had been railroaded by the same system, facing judges cut from the same cloth as Hargrove, but without a district attorney willing to risk everything for truth. "I can't promise miracles," Marcus told them honestly, "but I promise you won't be forgotten." Later, driving home past the imposing columns of the courthouse, where he had nearly been condemned to death, Marcus reflected on the bitter reality. For every case like his that drew attention and outrage, hundreds more languished in obscurity. The system acknowledged individual errors when forced to, but fiercely resisted examining its foundations. As the courthouse receded in his rearview mirror, Marcus made a decision. The trauma he had endured would not define him, but it would drive him. His engineering dreams would wait. First, there was more urgent work to be done, transforming his pain into purpose, his near tragedy into advocacy for those still trapped in the machinery of injustice. He pulled into his driveway, where Walter waited on the porch with a stack of case files. "Ready?" the older man asked. Marcus nodded, taking the files. "Ready,"